Okay, let's start. So welcome everyone to the eighth session of our e-roundtable. Images is a society of the alumni of IIMs, and we are hosting this weekly e-roundtable where we bring you some insights from the business world. Our session today is a conversation with the CEO staying at top, and our guest today is Sunil Duggal. Welcome, Sunil.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Welcome also to all the people who have joined us and people who will be joining us. Uh, at the outset, let me introduce Sunil to all of you. Sunil is an engineer from BITS Pilani. He did his MBA from IIM Calcutta in 1981 and joined Dabur in 1994. He became the CEO of Dabur in 2002 and retired in 2019 after 17 years. In these 17 years, the revenue grew from 1264 crores to 8,533 crores, nearly a sevenfold growth. The profits multiplied more than 10 times, and the market capitalization increased from 1100 crores to 80,000 crores. Wow, Sunil, that in fact, till I actually got your resume, I didn't know some of these numbers. So,
Thank
I knew about your long stint, and one of the reasons I invited you today was because, in my mind, you are one of the few CEOs who have actually been at the top helm of a large company, large FMCG company for 17 years. Sunil earlier worked for Wimco and PepsiCo, and today he's on the board of a few companies and working at leisure. I would say, is that correct, Sunil?
you. Advisory, basically, which is not
Correct.
leisure, but
Okay. Okay.
it's good fun.
When I meant working at leisure, I meant working at his own pace and enjoying what he does. Okay, so when I was chatting with Sunil, Sunil pointed out three interesting things that I wanted to pick up from his career at Dabur. So while we'll focus on staying at the top, we also thought we'll focus on three interesting elements. One is, making the organization from a family-owned business to a professional organization. Second is globalization of business, and the third is succession planning. So, Sunil, why don't you tell us a little bit more about these three things that you think are significant achievements in this career of 17 years?
Yeah, coming to the first point, which is the professionalization. Now, this can only happen if the promoters have genuine intent and are ready to carry it forward despite ups and downs, successes, and occasional failures, and believe in the basic outcome which professional management will leave them. So if that happens, and also if there is some unification in terms of the leadership amongst the promoters, then professionalization is meaningful. Otherwise, very often two things happen. One is that the professionalization is considered a failure. The family comes back, and life goes on as before. Or this professionalization is really to fill a vacuum between the promoter and the next generation. The next generation is too young to take over the reins. The promoter is getting old, and they want somebody to bridge the gap. Now, that's all fine if the promoters are honest about it, but that's not true professionalization. It's really meeting a short-term need gap. In the case of Dabur, very interestingly, the intent was genuine. And uh, just to rewind a bit, often professionalization is triggered by a crisis in the company. The company is not doing well, the
Correct.
promoters are not able to run it, and then they say, okay, let's get professional management. But in the case of Dabur, the company actually was thriving. It wasn't that we did something extraordinary in the years to come. Of course, we grew it exponentially, much ahead of what was done earlier. But the company was a profitable, fast-growing, very solid set of brands, and even the processes and all were not there. But the infrastructure was very good in terms of plant, in terms of the brands especially. So at that point in time, handing over the keys of the kingdom to professional management required a fair amount of conviction that no matter what, this is the right step forward. Now,
What was the major driver, Sunil, for this?
the driver was that the Berman family, which owns 70% of the company, was in its fifth generation. Now, fifth generation means that the family is spread pretty thin. there was something like 10, 12, fifth generation members. And as you get into, from being brothers to cousins to second cousins to third cousins, the differences in terms of thought, in terms of the cohesiveness obviously comes down, and that's pretty
True,
natural.
true, true.
So the fourth generation of Burmans, which were not a large family even at that time, there were five brothers, decided that yes, this is the right time, because the next generation, which is 10 people, would find it even more difficult. And these five brothers were fairly cohesive, and they got together well. They had no expectations from the next generation. They said the next generation now has been brought up in a very different environment. Somebody started in India, somebody in the US, somebody in the UK. They all have very different views and circles of friends and philosophies. So they will not be able to pull together as a unified force. And you need a unified force to run the company. You can't break up the company into
Correct, correct.
bits. No company can be broken up, especially a company which has national brands.
Yeah.
So you can't do it. Some companies have tried it, like Vedanath, and they have not done well. So the company has to be unified at the central level. So the only recourse was professional management. It takes a lot of courage to make the statement when the company is doing well and nothing seems to be really wrong. But the conviction was there. So when I joined the company in '94, the chairman of the company, then chairman, who's no more now, unfortunately, he gave me this assurance that this company is on the way to professionalization. They're putting together external intervention in the form of McKinsey, who will help in this transition. And he says that if you join us now, you may be still reporting to a promoter, but in a couple of years' time, things will change, and you have to believe us. So I did believe him because he carried a lot of conviction. So it did, in a sense, stick my neck out a bit and leave Pepsi, established large multinational, and join a smaller company which was managed very differently. But it was a leap of faith, because I liked the company, I liked the promoters, and I liked the brands, and it gave me a larger platform to work on. And I joined in 1994. And the chairman was true to his word. In 1995, McKinsey came on board. And till 1998, we worked very closely with McKinsey in putting together a framework of professionalization in terms of people, processes, the whole 9 yards. All departments were under scrutiny. So the final architecture was institutionalized in 1998, and a professional management team put into place. Much of the earlier management was taken out of the business. I was perhaps the only survivor at that point in time, because I was one of the few people with professional qualifications to have joined them recently. Most of the other people were they were good people, but they were basically
people who had been
from
there
the
for a long
promoters for a long time, and maybe didn't have the skills required in terms of the modern management areas. So now, and when I joined the company in 1994, I was not even 40. So I wasn't expecting to become the CEO when the first professionalization happened. And it was pretty clear that you may not become the CEO now, but you'll be part of the top team. And in the future, you do have a shot at becoming the CEO, which was fine by me. So a CEO was gotten from a multinational company, a very qualified person from the same campus as Salil, you and me.
Okay.
And interestingly, the experiment didn't work, because when the gentleman joined in 1998, the company was doing fine. And in 3 years' time, the company actually was struggling. Because I think the culture which the person brought in, and the people which were inducted at various CXO levels, were really not equipped to deal with the Dabur and its own unique culture. So the company, from being thriving entity in 1998, was actually a basket case in 2001. In 3 years, they had undone a lot of the good work which had happened over the last almost 100 years. So, and the promoters at that time had exited. They had, in fact, moved out of the corporate office, which is outside Delhi, into a city office. And they were not interfering with the day-to-day affairs of the company. So what happened in 2001? They got together and said that this is not working. The team has not performed. And so what do we do? This is again when the chairman, the leader of the family, he said, no, the intent was right, the execution was wrong. So we put together a good plan. We executed badly. We got the wrong people, and perhaps we shouldn't have left the company so completely in the hands of the management. So normally, in 9 cases out of 10, the promoters would have said, "Okay, guys, we've tried it, hasn't worked. Let's get back into the business and run it ourselves."
Yes.
So in this case, the promoter said no. Just because the execution was wrong, that doesn't mean the design was flawed. So we'll come in for a few months, just make sure that we put together a team whom we can trust, and then we'll exit once again, which is precisely what they did. So they came back to the corporate office for 6 months, and got rolled up the sleeves and got working, seeing people, looking at candidates for CEO and other levels. And finally, they decided that no level is better than anybody else, and they chose me to become the CEO. That's when they elevated me in 2002.
So that's
And
an excellent lesson
so it
for
was,
some of the companies that are struggling with similar issues right now. Very interesting. This is amazing stuff.
yeah, but again, they don't seem to be. And I'm engaged with one such company, which I'll come to perhaps later on. Without naming the company, they're still struggling with the same thing. But I think they finally realized, and I've been able to convince them over the last 6-7 months of engagement that what the Dabur did was precisely right. And there may be some stumbles along the way, but this is the only course you have to ensure business continuity and prosperity. So rewinding back, 2002 is when I took over. The company was in shambles. The market cap was 1,000 crores. The revenue had gone down 20% over the last 3 years. And the investors who always saw this company as being one of the shining stars of future India consumer business were angry as hell. In fact, I still remember anecdotally that the head of a leading mutual fund, overseas mutual fund, very large mutual fund, he came to me in my office, demanded a meeting, and obviously I meet all the investors, and he was abusive. He's saying that you guys have let us down. We invested in a company when the stock price was so much, it's 1/10 of that or whatever. And this has blown a hole into all our bonuses, and you guys have just messed up. So I heard him out patiently, and I said, okay, don't throw the bucket at me. Just wait for a few months or for a year or so. I've just taken over, so I can't be held responsible for all the mess earlier. So he was nice, and he said, okay, I'll give you 6 months, and I want to see some improvements. I mean, they're very demanding, these investors.
Yes.
He held around 2%, 3% of the company, which is not a small number. So after 6 months, then I wrote him a list of what I intend to do and what I succeeded. And he says that my faith in the company is renewed. I will not just hold on to my investment; I'll add to it, which I think was very smart because the stock, like you mentioned earlier, was hammered. And then 3 years later, he sent me a letter that this is the best investment I ever made. I got 43% CAGR returns for 3 years, and thank you very much. But now I'm exiting, which was a big mistake even then. So anyway, the reason why
let's
they
move to
elevated
the
me
next
to this
point
job.
of globalization. So tell us about how that happened, and when did you start that journey?
Yeah, the globalization was something which happened around something like 4-5 years after I took over. First was just to get the domestic business right.
Correct.
The overseas business was housed in a franchisee run by one of the promoters, and it was largely a Dubai-centric business, largely a hair oil business, and struggling. It was doing badly, and the promoters are wondering what to do. I said, we ideally we need to take it over and converge it and draw sustenance from the domestic business, move people, etc., etc. So I think they saw the light. They handed over the business to us, and we took over the Dubai business, and we really grew it. It was an amazing experience. We put in new management, and the business grew exponentially, growing beyond the UAE and the Arabian belt into North Africa and beyond. And then we grew it inorganically into sub-Saharan Africa and adjacent markets like Turkey before venturing into the US, etc. So the reason for this was that we have a market which wants our products, and the Arabs we found were actually pretty fond of Dabur products because they were living in close proximity with Indians, and they had imbibed many of the habits which the Indian consumers had in terms of consumption. And from there, I mean, the Arab community is 200 million strong and reasonably and quite prosperous, in fact. So they form a very big consuming class, which we tapped into and did extremely well. But then we were constrained by the 200 million population, which was there in the greater, what we call the greater MENA region, which is from, say, Tunisia on one side and ending at Iran, Iraq on the other side.
Right.
So Iraq, sorry, Iran is not Arabic. So this meant that there was a constraint. The business would do well, very profitable, but there would be a cap on growth. That's when we bought a company in Turkey to grow a little bit northwards towards the European side. Turkey has a very close affinity to the Arab culture, even though people there don't speak Arabic. So we were able to tap into that platform, but we couldn't do it on our own. So we bought a company there, which was a very successful acquisition.
And that's
And
where, if you
then we
remember,
said
I got involved, Sunil.
That's
Sunil, I
right.
said
That's
that's where
right.
I got involved, and it was a wonderful
I
acquisition.
remember
It worked very, very well for you.
it was. And I'll come to the risks also because it wasn't an unmissed blessing, and I'll come to that in a while. And then we saw this huge market of 800 million people in Africa. I'm talking about the black Africans who were not consuming Dabur products because they were designed for Indians and Arabs. And we said how to tap into that market. We were able to make some headway with hair oils and all, but it was just a drop in the ocean. So then we got this opportunity of buying a company in Chicago, of all the places. Now, the Chicago company catered to African Americans, and they made hair care products which were unique to their type of hair, the very kinky, curly hair, so hair straighteners and stuff like that. So we said that whatever works in America will definitely work in Africa because the brand was known in Africa and very respected in Africa. So while we had the clear intent of being an emerging market player, this was a rare instance of a company buying a developed market entity to seed emerging markets.
Correct.
So we bought a $100 million company in Chicago to seed a potentially $1 billion market in sub-Saharan Africa. Very interesting segue, but again, the outcome was mixed. So the Turkey was, I think, like you said, a very good acquisition, but we found that the currency depreciation really messed up the P&L big time.
Okay.
Because in consolidation, if the Turkish lira was depreciating 10-20% a year, meant that there was an inbuilt issue in terms of the translated currency growths. But the company did extremely well, and now that the currency has stabilized last few years, it's been one of our best performers. The US company did extremely well in sub-Saharan Africa, which was the intent, but did badly in North America because consumer taste has shifted away from the type of products they were making into different products. And that also was a big learning that in many of these developed markets, and we are seeing the same trend emerge in India, consuming habits in terms of personal grooming, especially for women, change at lightning speed. So if you are not on top of that change, you can be left sidelined. Personal grooming is a very, very tricky area, unlike many others like food, etc., where tastes are a little bit more stable. So then when I left the company, retired from the company last year, overseas was around 30% of revenues and around 30% of profit. And brands like Vatika, for example, had more overseas revenue than in India. So that's a very interesting point. Contrary to what people think, none of our business overseas is shipped out of India. None of the products are shipped out of India. Everything is made locally. So we have local supply chains, which we believe is very critical to growing a consumer business in emerging markets. And secondly, there is nothing Ayurvedic about those products because Ayurveda as a system of medicine is not recognized in most countries and not accepted by the regulators because they want to protect their own systems of medicine. So we went into regulatory roadblocks every step of the way. So the whole business there is personal care. So we were fighting the toughest competition in the world, Unilever and Procter & Gamble and even strong local brands with our own Indian brand, Vatika and Dabur, etc. And the reason we succeeded was that we never played at the center of the market. Like in India, we always give the products a herbal twist And that resonates very well with people all over the world. So that's the globalization part. And the third, you said, is the succession. Shall I come to that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Yeah. So, after 20 years at the helm, I was wanting to call it a day because the job is very taxing, does take a toll, and the incessant traveling, etc., was also beginning to now begin to create a little bit. So I said it's time for. So I had taken a milestone of 60 years when I retire, which is a good time from operational work, and continue to do the kind of stuff which I'm doing. Now this was postponed by a couple of years because of certain local issues. But that's a different story. But I think the key thing was that the promoters told me that you have done a great job. You want to go, we respect that. But we give you one task. Last task is to get a successor. And here's a caveat: the successor has to be from within the company. Because we got somebody from outside the company and that didn't work. Sorry?
Has to be from within the company. Got it.
It has to be. That was a condition precedent. I mean, if you want to get somebody from outside, then don't even bother because we're not going to take anybody from outside.
Right.
So obviously, that makes a choice harder. Unlike the say Unilever or Proctors of the world, who have global management cadres that can pull out people from country A to country B and for CEO and any other level, our cadre is obviously limited, and we have to prepare for succession much more carefully than the big boys. So this process started off around 2 years before I was due to retire. And so we shortlisted 2 candidates on who we believed could take over. None of them were ready, but they could be groomed. And then I put together an intervention plan, which was very scientifically designed. It was my own creation, but it was both skill building in terms of getting them into courses, teaching them subjects beyond their core competency of sales and marketing, and much more importantly, building up their soft skills. I think soft skills is something which is often ignored. You can have a guy who's a great planner, thinker, executor, but just cannot run and build and manage teams.
True.
And that was a hard part. So, which I got mentors, very highly known mentors who would do the coaching. And there's a lot of resistance in India amongst management to coaching,
Right.
because management confuses coaching with counseling.
Correct.
And the two are poles apart. Coaching is something which builds you up. Counseling is something which sort of tears you down.
Yeah.
So once the successors were convinced that this is a coaching process, enabling them to build up their skills, they took to it very well, and we had a great outcome in terms of the kind of people they emerged, or the kind of leaders they emerged. So now this was all supposed to be completed by 2018, but around 2016-17, if you remember, Baba Ramdev came into the field, and
yes.
he came
he disrupted the marketplace a little bit.
like a force of nature out of the blue, and there was no precedent or strategy to deal with him through any textbook.
Correct.
So, because a godman selling consumer goods in that quantity and having such blind faith in the products was something unprecedented. So we decided that it makes sense for me to continue for another couple of years till that threat is mitigated, which is what I did. And by 2020, I'm glad to say that we were back in the game, stronger than ever, and the competition had been largely neutralized.
Okay.
So
thank you, Sunil. That was very, very useful. I'm sure people would have learned a lot from there. Let me also tell the participants, if they have any questions, they can either put it in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll take them along the way. Meanwhile, let me continue this conversation with Sunil. Sunil, I wanted to ask you, what are some of these, you mentioned that the leadership qualities and soft skills are very important. And I think 30 years down the line, we all know that, many of these things are not taught at IIM. So would you highlight 2 or 3 of these which you think are the most important? In your view, and maybe something about how one can actually develop it.
What's important is, and something which seems very basic, but is not really practiced in any meaningful manner in the situations I've been in, is to basically share credit and, in fact, give credit to others, even if you've really earned it more than anybody else. I think that endangers loyalty. Everybody knows what you have done and what they have done. And if the praise comes on there and the rewards come to them, it builds very strong loyalty. Secondly, I believe, and this is my personal belief, that in a operationally heavy company like say Dabur, any consumer facing company, the CEO has to be what I call an operator.
Hmm.
Now, you have a lot of high quality strategists in our profession, and almost all of them fail because they think but they can't execute. So you need reasonable. I'm not saying you don't need thinking skills or planning skills. You do, but you need even stronger executional skills. So anybody who doesn't have that, and I have always chosen people with very strong operational skills. I want operators,
Hmm.
and I can, hire people to think like consultants, etc. But I can't hire people to execute. For them, it has to start from the top. If the CEO just gives orders sitting in his office and doesn't hit the field, then he's not going to work. So that's what I did. I used to spend 10 days in the market, which was one of the reasons which was very tiring, but at the same time very energizing also.
So
Because
Sunil,
that,
when I've worked together with you, I've seen you actually taking an operations meeting really. And but the question is that a lot of people believe that as you get to the top, as you become a CEO, you should be spending more time on strategy and delegate and let people do the execution. Any comments on that thought?
yeah, I think you got to balance the two. You can't be just a thinker and a strategist. I'm talking about a consumer-facing business. If you're in a different type of business, things will be different.
Okay.
But here, you have to empower as well as uh, take the mantle. So my working style was that do intense business reviews once in a quarter,
Right.
deep dive, right, and just iron out all the issues, come to alignments, and then for 3 months you just leave the people alone.
Okay.
Don't bother. You have, of course, monthly reports, etc., etc. But I used to discourage these PowerPoint presentations every week, which many CEOs love.
Hmm.
I said, no, I won't bother you. You don't bother me. 3 months later, we'll meet again and we'll do another deep dive. So something like 3 weeks in a quarter was taken up by the business reviews all over the world, whether it's Chicago or Istanbul or Cairo or, of course, Delhi and Dubai. We used to have these reviews. And after that, it was pretty much business taken over by them. But having said that, to keep a pulse on the market, I used to do a lot of market work. Now,
Right.
that wasn't disruptive because you just go to some place, whether in India or overseas, and do a store check, talk to people, meet the dealers, and the business goes on, but you are still pretty much aware of what's happening. So I was never a control freak by any stretch of the imagination. I used to empower people a lot.
Okay. So I have a question from Ravi Chandran. He says, for a 100-plus-year-old company that has organically grown, were inorganic acquisitions like Balsara helpful in a significant way?
They were. That's a good question because I think Balsara was our finest acquisition. One is that we got it cheap because the company was bleeding money and we knew exactly how to stop the bleed and by just cutting the costs, merging it with the main company. And then the portfolio was something which was very interesting. They had an oral care portfolio. So we had an oral care brand, which was very strong at one point in time, declined. If you remember Lal Dant Manjan,
Right.
and we were desperate to get into the toothpaste segment because that's what the future was. So this enabled us to fast forward that journey, get a stable of toothpaste from Balsara, which has done extremely well for us. And we were able to piggyback perhaps our most successful recent offering called Red Toothpaste on the back of that oral care. And now we are the number two oral care player in the country, just behind Colgate and the fastest growing.
Sunil, we
So
have another question from Mahavir. Mahavir asks, what are the key learnings and skills you suggest for people in middle management? So this is similar to what we were talking earlier. And one of the skills that I understood was to stay focused on operations. The second I heard was stay in touch with the market. So are there any other tips for this gentleman who
I
wants to
think
know that?
understand your consumer, and don't use market research always as a proxy for understanding the consumer. Consumer and customer as in the retail, the whole channel partners, and consumer as in the end consumer. So you've got to be, now it's not very easy to meet the end consumer beyond a certain time, but why I go to the market is I listen and talk to the dealers, and sometimes just sit in the shop and watch the consumers coming in and buying stuff and see their thought process, talk to them at times. This is invaluable learning, and even if you spend few days in a month doing that, it really enriches your job tremendously. Most
Till,
marketing people use market research as a proxy for this, which I think is very damaging because market research is very imperfect tool.
so till when did you actually do this? When was the last time you actually went into the field and sat with
I
a
think
dealer?
when I was serving out my 3-month notice prior to the retirement, I made one trip to Bangladesh and one to, I think it was Hyderabad,
Okay,
to do all
excellent.
this, meet the people, and then of course,
Excellent.
so it never stopped because I never saw this as a journey which is ending, departing on the
So
back to somebody else.
I'm not sure if you want to take this question, but if you can, a couple of lines. Uma Shankar wants to know, curious to understand the current scenario between Dabur and Patanjali.
I think Dabur is very much on top. Patanjali has got a little bit of a lease of life in the COVID era because of some belief that his products offer some immunities, building the strength coming from the stable which he runs. But I think earlier on it was fueled by almost mass hysteria that he is selling genuinely superior products at genuinely lower prices. So once the price value equation was crystallized by consumption, the fever died very quickly. So it was like a forest flame which burns and then gets extinguished very quickly. I think Dabur is very much on top. Patanjali is not very consequential anymore.
Thanks, Sunil. Sunil, my next question is something that I love to ask, all CEOs, even friends. So there's this thing about being very lonely at the top, right? What's your reaction to that comment? Is it really lonely, or is it something that can be managed, and how do you manage?
I think it's as lonely as you want it to be. You can shut yourself in an ivory tower and be the boss. So in inverted commas, give people appointments when they want to meet you, or you can mingle. And one important cultural aspect of Dabur was that we all used to assemble in the lunchroom at 1:30 every day. I'm talking about the senior management.
Hmm.
And we all used to just talk anything except business, politics or social issues or whatever. And eat together, the same dining room, etc. And that half an hour to 45 minutes, which I used to spend every day with the team, was so enriching. So therefore, I think, like I said, it's as lonely as you want it to be, and never shut yourself away from people.
So one of the interventions I suggested to the CEO of a 1,500 people company was that, go and have lunch with different people every day. Go to the canteen, have lunch with just go and sit on a different table and have a
Yeah,
conversation.
that too.
You know,
Having said that, if you do that, the people who are at the say junior management level are so awestruck that it
no,
takes.
but they get used to it. I think over a period
Yeah,
of time, they realize that he may just come and sit with us.
it takes time. You're right, but it's much easier to open up with the senior management because
Absolutely.
they see you more often, and
Absolutely.
then the culture filters down. And then, like I said earlier, you spend time in the field, and that's where you shake hands with all kinds of people. I used to insist that my head of sales doesn't come with me when I go to the market.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I meet him every day at the corporate office. So I want to see head of sales -1 and -2,
Wonderful.
and maybe -4, 5, and 6 too. Those
Wonderful.
are the guys I never get to see. So that's another filter which one can adopt.
Okay. Here's another question from someone who has not shared his name. What is the toughest decision you have taken as CEO in Dabur?
Well, it's a tough decision every time. And I think the toughest decision was that should we venture into the package foods business, basically the fruit juice business, or should we stay away from it? And it was a brave call because this was a business entirely alien to our way of working and our entire product range. But it turned out to be one of our most successful initiatives, and a very brave one because it meant sinking a lot of capex, getting into a business which we had very little understanding about, building a supply chain which was so different from our regular products. A very tough decision, and we agonized over it for a long time before we took the plunge. And I think it made now Real Juice is Dabur's number one brand.
Absolutely.
Revenues of around 1,500 crores. So it paid off. It paid off very well.
So Sunil, another question, in most of these organizations, especially in the corporate world, you find a lot of sycophants and you find a lot of naysayers, how do you handle such people? So, you meet them everywhere and sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes
if one thing is there that once people realize what kind of person you are, the naysayers disappear and so do the sycophants.
Okay.
They know that they don't have any place, and it's easier to deal with sycophants because you just tell them to do their job and not suck up to anybody. It's harder to deal with naysayers because it's sometimes the DNA of the person is such that he cannot change. So you just get rid of them because people who are very negative and who cast bad outlook and can create a bad atmosphere. There's only one thing you should do is to take them out of the organization.
Any specific situation that you remember that you would like to share?
In which context?
In the context of handling these people, different kinds of people.
Yeah, I think when we had a very high performance manager who somehow became very embittered because he probably didn't get a promotion which he thought he did. And from becoming a huge enabler of business, he became one of the biggest negative forces in the organization. He was one of the original managers whom we inducted. So he had 20 years of experience in the company. And he had built a department and done a lot of good things for the company. But he was undoing a lot of that by his disruptive behavior. So then, one day I called him to the office. I said, this cannot work. I'll give you 3 months or even longer if you want. I'll give you all your benefits, including stock options, which you normally forfeit. So I'll give you a soft landing financially, but I don't want you to be in the organization. So I think he took it in good spirit. So be a little open-handed in terms of the exit policy, but do not deviate from your basic principles.
One more question from Ritesh. What are the key factors you consider before diversifying in a chosen area?
What are your competencies there and what is the strategic intent, right? I mentioned two areas where we decided to diversify into completely unknown territory. One was buying this company in America to seed sub-Saharan Africa. So we saw a pool of 800 million consumers there, which were pretty much the way Indian consumers were 25 years ago or 20 years ago. So there was a strategy behind it, even though the capabilities did not exist. So we had to acquire the capabilities, and it took us a lot of time to do that. So this is really the most important factor while taking a business decision is really what is the strategy which goes behind it and what are the competencies. And if you have both, then it's a very easy decision. But even if you have one, sometimes you take that risk, calibrated risk that you have got one of the two competencies and you build the other one. So you have the strategy and you build the capability, or you have the capability and you craft a strategy around it.
Great. So last question, how much in this journey has your MBA education helped you, or how much of it has been something that you have literally learned on the job?
If you were to ask me that what decision came from marketing 301, so answer to that is I don't know. I think I wouldn't have got where I was, and I wouldn't have been as successful had I not been for a very good education. Even the engineering education, while I decided very early on in life that I don't want to be an engineer, my third year of BITS or thereabouts, I think the scientific temperament it built stands me in incredibly good faith even now. And the MBA education inculcated some concepts which somehow lurk in the subconscious
Hmm.
It will emerge whenever a crisis is there. So I would not uh, minimize the values of this education. It's very, very important.
But is it fair to say that this education is more used in the background, and you have to be constantly learning to actually stay on the top?
Yes, you have. I mean, when you and that's you when you uh, join as a management trainee, the realization is that what happens on the field is something very different from what you learned in sales 101,
Hmm.
because that is a very different construct, and this is something completely different. But I
And
think your learning curve is much sharper if you have a good education.
correct. And and I also tell people, and I don't know what your view is, that you also have to be extremely flexible. So if you come out of business school expecting that you will do this, and this is the role that you will perform, and this is what you'll do, and this is what you'll not do, it's not gonna work.
It's not going to work. Yes, you got to learn. You got to be humble,
Yeah.
and often the learning comes from people very much down the corporate ladder.
Okay, Sunil, that was a wonderful session. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for all the attendees who joined us. As usual, we will be putting up a link on the YouTube channel. You can search for it by the name Images, IIMAGES. And we will have a next session next Friday. Our next session is about demystifying machine learning. So we have a couple of experts in machine learning who have built a company in machine learning, and we will have a conversation with them on trying to understand what it is all about. And like Sunil said, what is the difference between AI and ML? So, I don't have an answer. Hopefully next week I'll have an answer. Thank you, Sunil, for
Thank you.
joining us, and thank you everyone for joining. Thank you very much.